Welcome to New Rechts, or for our English listeners, New Right. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today we're going to talk about what I would call a sensitive topic, and that's the transgender movement and the impact it has on real people, on real families. And I'm glad to talk about this topic today with Keith Jordan. Thank you for being here today to talk about it.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
Of course, we're going to talk a lot about the specific topic today, but before we get into that, maybe you can tell a little bit about your background so people know who I'm talking to today.
For sure, yeah. Well, I don't know how far back you want to go, but in 2018, I was obliged really to start parent peer support in the United Kingdom for families who had children who thought they were transgender. And this is because 2 years previously, so about nine and a half years ago now, my daughter claimed to be a man. And at the time, there was very little help, advice, support around for families in this situation. One exception is an organisation in the United Kingdom called Transgender Trend, which is run by a lady called Stephanie Davies-Arai. So I spoke with her and said to her, do you do parent support? Because her organisation was trying to educate society on what was happening and particularly what was happening in schools. And we had a discussion, and I realised that somebody had to do it, and that somebody was going to have to be me. So that's how support for parents of children who think they're transgender started in the UK about 6.5, 7 years ago. And that's what we've been doing ever since.
It's I appreciate that you're willing to tell this. Of course, I can only imagine how difficult that must be as a parent to face that, and also to realize that there is no support for people in such a situation. So yes, how do you? I'm quite curious. How has been the reaction to the fact that you started Our Duty, this organization, because it's such a controversial issue, and even though you're trying to help parents, I think you got a lot of support or a lot of backlash. What has been your experience?
Well, you're right. There has been backlash. An internet search will find some wacky transgender people saying that we're the devil incarnate.
Yes.
But by and large, we've it's quite hard to explain. We haven't received great plaudits. We haven't received great amounts of opprobrium either. We've just sort of carried on doing what we're doing, which is helping families navigate this problem. So in the early days, I'd say, about 5 or 6 years ago, then yes, I was called a transphobic bigot. Yes, I had death threats and all sorts of other horrible emails, and I just chose to ignore them. But I don't think I've had any real pushback for a good few years now. I think the world has come to terms with the idea that there is now opposition to the transgender lobby, and so things have settled down. Initially, those who were trying to push for greater acceptance of transgenderism adopted a policy of no debate. I don't know whether any of you experienced seeing that hashtag no debate. Our existence is not up for discussion, and all these weird things that they would say. But we're way past that now. There is a debate, and we're having it.
Yes, there's definitely been a debate. Of course, you see now what's happening in America as a good example. Before we dive into actually what our duty does, maybe we should start a little bit because there might be people I don't know watching that will ask the question: why does it bother you so much? Well, let's play devil's advocate for a second, so you can actually express the underlying issue. What's the problem with let's say young people saying that they're the opposite sex? It's maybe to me it's maybe an obvious question, but maybe not to everyone else who is listening.
Well, you would like to think it's obvious, wouldn't you, really? And why the obviousness of it was not apparent to people right from the start is something that still surprises me. It's a lie. It is as simple as that. Transgenderism is profoundly dishonest. A man cannot be a woman. A woman cannot be a man. For a person to say that they are the opposite sex is a lie. It's as simple as that. And I do find it very difficult to comprehend how society allowed that lie, such an enormous lie, to take hold and become normalized. It absolutely defeats me. I do not understand how society could have accepted it. Not only is it just wrong, as a statement of material fact, but it is also profoundly harmful to those people who get the idea that they are the opposite sex, and then in the most bizarre irony, decide that they then must medicalize in order to become a simulacrum, an imitation of the opposite sex. Whereas if, as they claim, they are already the opposite sex, why do they need to? It's got so many contradictions, transgenderism. It just does not stand up to any scrutiny at all. And yet, leading politicians around the world have been bamboozled into accepting some of the tenets of transgenderism. And I personally just cannot fathom why.
I think for most people, the primary argument is for most people, I think it doesn't make sense, but they're like, you know what? I think many people don't see the harm. That you have heard this saying, you can either have a dead child or a transgender child. People are like, people have this condition. Maybe this will help them feel better about themselves. I think this is what most people who are just maybe ignorant a little bit about the topic believe. You're saying that it's harmful. Can you maybe explain a little bit of what kind of harm you're talking about for these children?
For sure. Once a young person decides that they are the opposite sex, they are going to want medical interventions to better imitate the opposite sex. And so that would typically involve cross-sex hormones, so taking hormones that are naturally at high levels in the opposite sex. So a girl would take testosterone, a boy would take estrogen. And in taking those hormones, the young person would develop the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex. So a boy would start growing breasts and his skin would become softer. A girl would, taking testosterone, her voice would break and she would become hairier. And the distribution of fat on the body will change as well, so the shape of the body will change a little. Now, these hormones, they don't just have an effect on physical appearance. They will have other things will be going on inside that you can't necessarily see. So a girl taking testosterone for a long time is likely to end up in premature menopause, which will result in premature osteoporosis. You could also have girls taking testosterone can end up with their vagina will dry up, their uterus shrivel up, they might require a hysterectomy. And there's also a rather unpleasant side effect called clitoromegaly, where the clitoris actually grows larger on taking testosterone, and that can actually be very painful because of its size. So there's a whole load of side effects that render taking cross-sex hormones harmful. And then beyond that, then there's the desire for surgeries, and commonly girls will want to have their breasts amputated. Well, breasts aren't just a pretty feature of the female body. They are a functioning organ. They exist to provide nurture for a baby they might have, but also they are part of the sex organs in that they are involved in stimulation and pleasure, in intimacy. And so losing breasts is not a trivial act at all. It's not just a cosmetic procedure. And for the boys, the young men, amputation of the testicles and the penis in order to create an imitation vagina is one of the operations that's on offer. And frankly, my toes curl just thinking of it. When these young people, as they often do, realise the harm they've done themselves, realise that they are not the opposite sex, and start to regret, start to desist from their transgender ideation, detransition, they are going to be left with bodies that are not as healthy as they would have been had they not gone down the path of transgenderism.
I think this is, thank you for that. I think it does give a good overview that it's, we're talking about something very serious, physically, mentally. Okay, so there are, I guess, more and more people, and of course your organization focuses on parents, so there are more and more parents that find themselves in these situations where their children come home and say, I'm now transgender. What does our duty actually do to help these people in the situation?
Primarily, we help parents understand that they are not alone, that there are other parents in the same situation as they are, which that was very, very important when we started. Now, because there's so much more information out there, and because the resistance to transgenderism is now becoming mainstream, that angle is less of an issue. But what we can do specifically is we can help parents help each other, and that is important because every family dynamic is different. Every family is different. Every child is different. And so there is not a one-size-fits-all solution to this problem when it happens. And, different parents will try different things, and some things will work and some things won't. And we need to help parents come to terms with the idea that this is very rarely a quick fix. If your child's fairly young, 14, up to maybe 15 and a half, you can probably get away with being a strict parent and say, no, you're not transgender. But the older children, or if they spent a lot of time online and they've ruminated on this, it's going to be much harder for the child to come out. And parents come into this problem hoping, expecting a quick route out, and there isn't one if the child's too far in. And so we help them create the environment in their family where it's more likely that their child will desist from transgender ideation. So it's harder than it looks. Take, for example, a lot of parents come to us and say, oh, can you get me a therapist? My child needs a therapist. And that's a totally understandable first reaction.
Of course.
But if you consider that the child is committed in their mind to becoming transgender, there's all this propaganda out there saying that if anyone tries to talk them out of it, it's conversion therapy, which is a nasty piece of propaganda. That's it's actually been passed as a law in Canada and in other places where you can't attempt to talk a child out of thinking of themselves to be transgender. So we try and create this environment where the child decides for themselves. If you get therapy, I don't know whether you're familiar with how most therapy works, but you need the buy-in of the patient. And a child, a recalcitrant teenager, is not, especially one that's been told what to say and what to believe, they're not going to buy into the therapy. So it's just going to be wasting money.
That's a fair point. I'm actually a psychologist by background, so I know it quite a bit. And I would say I'm curious what you think about this. One of the things we're seeing in many Western countries, you mentioned Canada, we see it in other countries in Europe as well, is normally psychologists, their first reaction is not to per se affirm what the client is saying. And to give you an example, if you have an anorexic person come to you, and this person who is severely underweight, and he or she says, I think I'm overweight, you're not as a psychologist going to say, oh, I agree with you. You are indeed overweight. You should eat less, because then this patient can actually die. But with the situation we're now in many countries, it's actually the psychological institutions are trying to put pressure that you have to affirm this gender identity of transgender children. Is this something that you also, is it difficult for you to recommend psychologists for this reason as well, I would imagine?
Yes. In the United Kingdom, we have a problem called the Memorandum of Understanding version 2, which a lot of the psychotherapeutic organisations have signed up to, which basically paints talking a child out of transgender ideation as conversion therapy, and so therapists aren't allowed to do it. And I think your point about anorexia is the perfect analogy to this, because anorexia is another adolescent harmful ideation, just as transgender ideation is. They get the idea in their heads that they're overweight when they're not.
Yes.
And a child gets the idea in their heads that they are the opposite sex when they're not. So the similarities are pretty clear in terms of adolescent susceptibility to ruminate on ideas to the point that they believe them with no good cause.
Yes, people are vulnerable to it, right? When you're young, you're forming your identity. Puberty for most children, for example, is difficult. You're trying to figure out who am I. You're trying to maybe separate a little bit from your parents, look more at your peer groups. It's all quite understanding. You already said that's not a quick fix. There's no magical solution to this problem. But can you tell a little bit about your success rate, maybe some success stories of what you have been able to accomplish with parents?
Yeah, for sure. you know, I've been doing this, as I said, now for 6.5 years, and whenever a parent tells me that their child has stopped thinking of themselves as transgender, I still well up. I still get very emotional about it. It's yeah, our greatest success stories are quite often ones that we can't necessarily talk about because they bring a spotlight onto the family or onto the child. But it's very much when we have a child who desists, who's out of the woods, and we know they're going to be all right. We know the risk of unnecessary medicalisation has been removed from their lives, and it's the greatest feeling in the world when you get that call. Other successes, obviously, we have been instrumental in leading the debate, I would say, in terms of getting this subject discussed in terms that it otherwise might not be discussed in. So, for example, we've always taken a pretty hard line, which has created the space for other organisations to appear more reasonable. Because, you know, you can't... If we weren't the extremists, then the moderates would then be labelled extremists. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. What do you mean by extreme? What's the extreme position then that you would say that you take?
Well, the extreme position that we take is that we believe that the gender clinics should be closed. That opposite sex imitation medicine or sex trait modification medicine is entirely elective and cosmetic, and therefore should be available on that basis and not as some kind of imaginary cure for a non-existent pathology known as gender dysphoria. So that's quite a hardline position to take, or it certainly was when we started out about 6 years ago. But in taking that position, it does sort of open up the Overton window for more debate to happen. So you know, there's little things like that. I guess we haven't really got like a huge success story that we can say our duty did this. You know, we played our part in a lot. You know, we started the conversation in the United States back in 2020 by advertising Abigail Shrier's book. We took a billboard out in Los Angeles to advertise her book, and you could argue that started the debate off in the public eye in the United States. But a lot of other people were doing stuff similar at the same time. So we were part of something bigger. But yeah, it's hard to point out one single thing. You say, yes, our duty did this, and aren't we brilliant? But we're doing lots of things that we're making a positive contribution to.
That makes sense. Only thing I would slightly disagree with what you were saying there is I do think that gender dysphoria is a psychopathology. Like just with anorexia, people is actually a real thing. People can have a deluded idea that they might be born in the wrong body. Even before the hype started, it was extremely rare, right? But it did happen. So I would say that doesn't mean that it's a biological reality. But I would make the nuance that actually this psychopathology does exist. It is now, of course, we get social contagion, why it's amplified on a massive scale. But even before that, it happened a little bit at least. That's the only thing that I would add.
I would accept that, and it's one of those things that I think the debate needs to happen as to at the moment, gender dysphoria in the DSM-5, which is how it's defined, it is a list of feelings. Now, is that grouping of feelings sufficient to be a diagnosis, or is it just a list of feelings? And obviously the truth lies somewhere in between, but it needs closer examination. And yes, the one thing that always perplexes me when we're talking about is gender dysphoria real, is the cases of the young boys about 4 or 5 years old who say that they're a girl, and it's typically boys, and it's about that age, and that's a completely different cohort to the one that we're concerned with, because we're concerned with adolescents. But historically, there has been this to my mind, inexplicable phenomenon of 4 or 5 year old boys declaring that they're girls, and it would be wonderful to find out exactly what's going on there, but it does make describing what's happening to the adolescents much harder, because even if the adolescence is entirely the adolescent phenomenon is entirely harmful ideations, you've got this evidence of 4 or 5 year old boys, which is giving those people who would say, but it's a pathology, it's giving them something that they can use to highlight that point of view. And I'm no scientist, but and also my area of concern at the moment is very much on making sure that adolescents aren't harmed.
Of course.
But I'd love to know the answer to that. That it really does intrigue me.
I guess me too. I guess the problem is that, of course, it's very hard to actually do research on this because of the sensitivity, and you're basically, to have a neutral research on this, it will be very difficult, especially if the results are not in line with, let's say, the transgender ideology. So that's why it's maybe difficult to answer. But something that we have seen in research, I guess, is that a lot of the people that have gender dysphoria, if you just don't do anything, a lot of them either grow over it or they turn out to be homosexual. This is of course something we see a lot, and it's understandable when you know that 10% of the population has the temperament of the average of the different sex. So 10% of men on average have the temperament that's similar to the average woman, and the other way around. So of course, if you then live in a world where you say if you feel a little bit more feminine or a little bit more masculine, then you must be the different gender. Of course, it makes it much easier for people to think, okay, maybe I'm just a boy born in a female body. Of course, that it's crazy, but I think I agree with you. More research is needed. I'm curious, kind of the scale, because you say it's of course you cannot claim that only because of your work families are able to overcome this. I understand, but can you tell me a little bit about how many families you have helped over these years? Is there something you can share there?
It's very difficult to again, because it's quantifying these things is really, really difficult. We have our fastest result was 2 weeks. We had a parent come in and their child was young, about a 13-year-old girl, and we said, okay, well, they're 13, so these are the things you can try. Take their internet away, make sure that you vet their friendship groups, that sort of thing. And it was all done and dusted within 2 weeks. We have had other families who've been with us for years, and then their child desists. I will say that, as a mea culpa, we haven't kept accurate records of, what each family comes to us with, and what they leave with, and quite a few leave as soon as their child desists, and we don't track them. We're so understaffed and underfunded that we just do what we do.
I understand.
So it's really hard to put a finger on it, and I'd love to be able to, but we get a feel for it. We'd say, over time, about half will desist, and that, to my mind, isn't good enough. We want all of them to desist. But some children go off to university and they will cut off their parents. They'll self-alienate themselves, and that makes life very difficult.
Of course.
So it's a difficult picture.
I understand. I understand, especially when you say that you're understaffed and underfunded. When we're talking about that, I'm quite curious. Are you collaborating with any other organizations? Are there organizations in different countries that you work with, or do something similar?
Yeah. Different countries work in different ways. We've got 4 chapters in the United States, and they tend to work with local groups that historically were set up by an organisation called Parents of ROGD Kids. The UK, we're the original peer support group in the UK, so we run peer support in the UK. We've got a group in Germany called Transgenderisme, if I pronounced that correctly. They do their own thing. We collaborate with other groups. There's a self-standing group that hasn't any formal affiliation with us in Italy called Generazione AD, but we'll share notes with them and we'll work with them at that level. So that, depending on the country and the setup, there's different levels of collaboration. We'll happily work with anyone who's got the same interests as us, and that's basically stopping the medicalisation of children and stopping the school to clinic pipeline as well. So there's lots of indoctrination that happens in schools, and that is part of the problem in terms of children getting the idea that they might be transgender. So there's that whole ecosystem of activist school teachers telling children that it's okay to be transgender and so on and so forth. That is a big part of the problem.
Yes, that is definitely true. I'm also quite curious. You say we work together. Of course, this problem is not going away anytime soon. I think we can agree we're starting to get some momentum, for example, in the United States on this issue. But there's a long way to go. I guess in the rest of, especially in Europe, I think it's still a long way to go. What can people do to support you, to support our duty if they're listening to this conversation? They're like, I like the purpose of this organization.
Well, for sure, we'll always welcome donations, and there's a donation button on our website. Most importantly is doing your bit to save children, and I think in that cause, not accepting the promotion of transgenderism as a valid lifestyle as best you can. So, the feminist organisations that are fighting to uphold the right of women to have women-only spaces, that's a good cause. understanding what is actually going on, amplifying our message or similar messages. So if you're on social media, engage with it. Be brave. If you've got pronouns in your bio or your email signature or your LinkedIn profile, get rid of them. Anything that perpetuates the myth of transgenderism, do your best to suppress it, not promote it. Let's get back to where we were 20 or 30 years ago when, yes, we know there are middle-aged men who cross-dress, but, that's something that they do in private, in their own little clubs, in their own little rooms. And let's get back to a place where it's actually taboo to force those kinds of behaviours on the rest of us. We don't have to accept it. I'm all for live and let live, but when your behaviour is influencing my quality of life, particularly my ability to raise my children as I see fit, healthy, and of sound mind, then that needs to be pushed back in the closet, I'm afraid.
It's a very good point. I really want to thank you for this interview and taking the time to share your story today. I'm happy that there are not that many media in the Netherlands that are sharing any of this. So thank you very much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Daniel.
And also, of course, thanks to all our listeners and all our supporters of New Rechts. If you want to make more of these conversations possible, please consider becoming a member at newrechts.nl, and see you in the next one.